afternoon, everyone. Hello, and thank you for joining us. I'm Kathy Hawks, Associate Dean for External Relations and Global Programs. Thank you so much for joining us live online today to celebrate all of the generous support to the MIT Sloan Annual Fund and to the Dean's Circle. We are thrilled that we have Professor Renée Gosline joining us for this amazing opportunity to bring all of you back to the classroom. And shortly, you'll hear from a fellow Dean's Circle member, Vincenza Ngro, to introduce Professor Gosline more formally. But first, I must thank you for your generous support this year. The Sloan Annual Fund and the Dean's Circle kept us going through this COVID-19 pandemic. It offered fellowships to our students. It helped fuel our research and keep our action learning programs strong for our students. It helped the school address challenges that we know are going to be there in the days ahead. And we thank you for your partnership through all of that. There are 4 things that you should know before we get started. Please turn your camera on if you are able. I know we can't be together today, but it certainly feels a little bit more so if we can see each other's faces. We're recording this session today, and we'll share with all Dean's Circle donors next week who aren't able to join us. Your microphones will be muted during the presentation of the session, and the Q&A will happen for about 15 minutes at the end. So please enter your questions through the chat throughout our session. Now it is my pleasure to turn things over to your fellow Dean's Circle donor, Vincenza Ngro, class of MBA 2012. Over to you, Vincenza.
Thank you, Kathy. I look forward to spending time with all of you today. As Kathy mentioned, my name is Vincenza Ngro, and I am a member of the executive MBA class of 2012. I am also a host committee member of the MIT Sloan Women's Conference and have been a Dean's Circle donor for over 5 years. I am pleased to have the opportunity to introduce Professor Gosline, who I worked closely with during my time on the committee for the Women's Conference held in 2019. Professor Gosline and I worked on the panel titled Fighting Unconscious Bias in the Quest for Authentic Leadership. And there she inspired us with her dedication to the panel and to the topic. And I'm super excited to hear her lecture today. Professor Gosline is a senior lecturer in the Management Science Group at MIT Sloan and head of the new Human AI Interaction Group at MIT's Initiative on the Digital Economy. In 2020, Professor Gosline was named a Digital Fellow at Stanford's Digital Economy Lab. She is also a 2020 honoree on the Thinkers 50 radar list and has been named one of the world's top 40 professors under 40 by Poets and Quants. She is an expert on the intersection between behavioral science and technology and the implications for AI, for cognitive bias in human decision-making, which we'll hear more about today ahead of her forthcoming book, The Human Algorithm. She has many accolades that I could list, but I don't want to take up too much time. I know we are all eager to learn more about her research on the trust we instill in bots and algorithms as part of our decision-making framework. So I will turn it over to Professor Gosline to begin. Over to you, Professor.
Thank you so much, Vincenza, for that wonderful introduction. Thank you, Kathy, for including me in this event. It's always great to see you. And thanks everybody for joining me today. I hope you all have been safe and well. I'm going to share some slides with you, and I'm going to try to keep the slides going. I have about 20-25 minutes, I think, of slide sharing allotted. So I'll promise that I won't give you too many Greek letters and other kinds of coding tasks. If you promise me you'll use the chat to ask any questions that you might have along the way. So we'll talk about human-centered AI, really centering the humans behind the data points and thinking about what the implications for people are of the artificial intelligence and the machine learning that we are increasingly deploying. And I'll share with you some research that is ongoing on thoughts on bias and what that means for strategy and what that means for leadership. So let me start by saying that I don't have all of the answers on this. In fact, if anyone living today, any human living today tells you they have the answers on this, they're probably not telling you the truth. And that's because so much is unprecedented that from a data perspective, much of the historical data no longer is predictive because of everything changing, right? People's attitudes toward technology, people's lifestyles with the pandemic and digital transformation. Everything's really sort of happening so quickly and in a way that it really truly is unprecedented. The CEO of Microsoft, for instance, said that in the first 2 months of the pandemic, they experienced more digital transformation than they had in 2 years. And because we're sort of at the tip of the iceberg of AI's potential and what it means for people, we're just learning about what the promises and what the perils are. So my job today is not to answer every question under the sun, but rather to encourage you to think about where we're going and how we can think about what we should do now to ensure that where we're going is where we want to be. So I'll give you a spoiler alert or key takeaways that I want to touch on today. The first is that human beings are biased. I know that's not shocking to you all, but AI is learning from us. And therefore, AI is reflecting and magnifying those biases. So we need to be really careful about thinking critically. You know, in machine learning and coding, the phrase is garbage in, garbage out. If your data is biased, so will your model be. But that question often is kind of in the background now as we seek to really keep pace with other organizations that are being technologically advanced. So we should really bear this in mind. The other thing is that because humans are biased and AI is learning from us, this bias interacts. And I'm going to speak with you today about 2 studies that speak about how this is related to cognitive style and also what that means about our judgments as humans with regard to the accountability of the outcomes of bias that are affected or enabled by AI. And then if we have time, I'll share some steps to combat bias. And that's going to be important because the job is not just for data scientists, it's for all of us. So let me motivate the problem by saying that digital transformation, a phrase that I'm sure you've heard quite a bit, has really transformed the way in which we interact with customers, with people in our personal lives. I'm here talking with you via Zoom, and you're probably in contact with loved ones from afar because of the perils of travel at the moment through digital platforms. And indeed, the platform structure has supplanted traditional manufacturing structures in the top organizations in the world. So these are just some examples here of where you're really seeing a change in technology affecting what was traditionally considered B2B or B2C, allowing C2C, right? Customers to interact with one another, allowing B2B B2C to really have multi-directional flows where we have C2B, where your customers are telling you what they want, giving reviews, but also co-creating experiences in digital platforms, right? Also, where there's customer empowerment and customers are actually working as part of their experiences. So when travel was safer, airlines were able to offload some of the effort by having us check in ourselves, download or print our boarding passes ourselves, drop off our bags ourselves. And all of this has been enabled by digital transformation. And we're just at the beginning. Now, organizations, of course, have taken note, and McKinsey estimates that world business spending on AI will get to $110 billion annually by 2024, a double from $50 billion this year. Now, interestingly, though there's this race to adopt AI and machine learning, there isn't necessarily a full understanding of how to fully take advantage of that with regard to profit to organizations. So there are actually quite a few organizations relative to the vast majority that are adopting that have really figured out how to positively affect their bottom lines. But more importantly, I think for today is the issue that the implementation of this AI is so rapid that our understanding of what that means for us as humans is kind of trailing behind. And as a result, at MIT's initiative on the digital economy, we have a whole research group, of which I am head, about human AI interaction, where we are running studies, we are partnering with organizations to better understand who trusts AI, when, why, what this means for a customer's experience, what this means for delivering more value, and all of the important questions that we should be asking now and not later. So I want to start off with the foundation of behavioral economics. I'm actually not a coder, even though I live and breathe AI and machine learning all the time. I'm actually a behavioral scientist. And behavioral economics is the perspective that I use and experiments are the methodology that I employ to understand these phenomena. So I want to start with a very simple example. Here you see an image. Imagine yourself driving on a wooded road at night in the dark, and out pops this creature in front of you. What do you do? So please go to the chat. Tell me. This is a pop quiz, but I think you'll have the right answer. Go to the chat and let me know, what would you do if you're driving at night and this pops out in front of you? Let's see what you guys how you would react. Slam on the brakes. Yes, says Catherine. Swerve and avoid, stop. Yes, Chris, slam on the brakes. Slam on the brakes. Exactly. Stop. That's right. You really wouldn't have to do much analysis. You wouldn't need a model. You wouldn't have to measure the barometer, the moisture in the air, or the mass of the creature. Your feet would, or your foot would almost automatically go to the brake. So you passed the first test, and actually I'm surprised that no MIT person has given me an answer about, that involved a formula. So that's good. All right. So let me give you another example. Imagine that we were no longer in this sort of quarantine world and we could all go out to dinner together. Wouldn't that be nice? And imagine you're responsible for choosing the wine for the table. And you receive this wine list, which has many, many options. How would you decide what wine to order? Please go back to the chat. Let me know what you're going to do, how you're going to select a wine for the table. There's either a delay or we have a bunch of teetotalers. Okay. Ask what people like to drink. Choose DRC. I'm not sure what that means. Ask other people what they would like. Absolutely. What people are eating. Go to the right side of the menu. Interesting. I'd be interested to know why you would do that, Pam. And so you have different sort of decision rules. So some people would ask what other people are eating. All right, Kimberly, understand the budget constraints. That's right. And how much wine we intend to purchase. Absolutely. And Kimberly, you're quite nice in that you haven't said what many people would do, which is to identify a wine that didn't signal that they were too cheap, but also not a wine that suggested that they were spendthrift and that they were blowing budgets, right? Catherine, consider the food served. Yeah, so you might ask other people. You might ask someone, a sommelier or a waiter. You might think about something you've had in the past that you really like. We might think about what this signals. Either way, the decision process would be different than the situation with the deer, wouldn't it? In that first decision, you'd be able to make quickly. And that is really representative of what we call system one. That's your automatic, intuitive thinking that you don't have to put much sort of thought and effort into. It's your lazy thinking, if you will, and it's intuitive. Now let's contrast that with system two, right? That's your thinking slow. That's your considering different options, gathering more data, and these kinds of deliberative, more effortful decision-making that may actually be analytical as well, like thinking about cost implications. Now, this might sound familiar to you if you've read the book Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman and his Nobel Prize winning research. So this system 1 and this system 2 is important because it characterizes the way in which we think, and that all human beings have a system 1 and system 2, but that system 1 or 2 might not be appropriate given the task. So if a deer pops out in front of you, you don't want to employ system 2, right? You don't want to be thinking about sort of analytics. And if you have this wine choice, perhaps you don't want to make the choice that is best for you intuitively. You want to consider other people's preferences as well. Keep this system 1 and system 2 in mind, because I'm going to circle back to this when we talk about some of the research. Now, the important thing about system 1 and system 2 is that we often employ system 1, and that system 1 is often biased by things in our environments, right? That Homo economicus, right? This is how economists talk about the rational utility maximizing Homo sapien. Homo economicus is more of a myth than a reality in that we're not as rational as we'd like to consider ourselves. We're not as rational as we would expect. And there are copious amounts of examples, both in this particular book and others, that show how despite our best objectives, we're less rational than one might expect. And so the question becomes, can AI help us be better and be more rational, right? So think about, instead of Homo economicus, Homo technologicus. And that is the human being who outsources a lot of the cognitive tasks to oftentimes your phone, in order to make better decisions, right? In order to allow our sort of system 2 to not have to work as hard and to ostensibly make more accurate, more efficient, and more intelligent choices. So why do I care about this topic? This is actually a picture of me and my baby, my young son. And you might look at this photo and think, there's a new mom who is just in bliss with her new child and totally content and at peace with her baby sleeping on her chest. And I love my son and I love being a mom, and that's true. However, what really is in this picture is a physically exhausted woman who is a working mom who is cognitively overloaded because I was sleep deprived and still making important decisions, still teaching MBAs and executives, still trying to do research. And also because I was a first-time mom, having a real sort of strong desire to not mess it up, right? To do my best. And as a result, I found myself, even someone who knows a lot about AI and machine learning and the biases and so on, I found myself outsourcing my cognitive tasks as much as possible. So, when it came time to doing anything, I was really increasingly relying on technology to supplement my cognitive depletion. And importantly, I became decreasingly aware of this reliance. And that's really more than just an experience of new moms, but actually a large societal shift, the outsourced mind. And so as a new parent, when it came to typing in my passcode for my phone, I finally relented and said, you know what, just do facial recognition on my phone so I don't have to even exert that effort. And, I was very sort of focused on getting things right and protecting my child. And so possessing this product Owlet, which, goes on his body and tracks his heartbeat and his blood pressure and makes sure that he's actually alive through the night, which is a terrifying thought for new parents, and installing surveillance camera so that if he did start to make noise in the night, I could have a look and see, well, do I really need to get up, or did he just flip over and he's fine? Or even if the doorbell would ring, not having to get up and using the ring so I could see on the cam who's there. Is it just a delivery? Leave it there and not have to get up and exert any effort more than was necessary. And so that's what motivated this topic for me. And that's what I talk about in this book. But that's not unique to me, right? It's not unique because this human AI interaction is increasingly characterizing our decisions amidst digital transformation. And importantly, in some obvious ways and in some ways that are non-obvious. So for instance, potentially coming to a job near you, an AI teammate that can assess, well, you know, you're a bit exhausted now, let me take over, you're cognitively depleted, and would obtain data from you that would suggest when is the best time to intervene in cognitive fatigue. Or for instance, in Germany, for the first time, doctors are now able to prescribe apps, digital apps, right? So we know that there are apps that seek to help people with mental health, and even AI bots that serve as therapists. These apps also help people track the symptoms of their illnesses and help patients feel a sense of agency over their own health experiences and communicate with physicians in ways that we were not able to do before because lab tests were only periodical. Or even in the business realm, AI and machine learning systems being used to scan and analyze the population of applicants to a job and then whittle down those applicants based on the criteria that are programmed to then reduce the options and present the human with, you know, a dozen or so finalists for a position. And HireVue is but one company that's being used by many large and influential companies. So indeed, AI is everywhere in ways obvious and non-obvious. And so I would ask you, imagine you have a goal, and that is to get to MIT, and you live on the North Shore of Boston like I do. And you use Waze, which is a machine learning app that serves as a GPS. And Waze here tells you, as you can see, I have quite the commute. Waze here gives you three options that are pretty close in time. Which one would you choose? Go to the chat for me and tell me which one you would choose out of these three options, 1, 2, or 3. Okay, Kathy would choose 1. Eric would choose 2. Okay, Catherine, 2, 2, 1. Interesting. 1, 2, 2. No takers for 3 yet, I see. Right, so Elizabeth, I'm going with 1. Longer, but less traffic. Interesting. Thank you. Pam says 1. So what we're seeing here, right, is that your preferences, your ingoing biases, either toward an experience that you would like to have, less stressful for me to be in, you know, less bumper to bumper, or more, maybe you want that time. If you have an aversion to being on routes that have a lot of construction or a lot of police, maybe you have an economic constraint, and so 1 would be the one you go for because it's the one without the toll. Whichever your preferences are, right, this would affect what you choose. And that's important to understand, that therefore your human ingoing choices would affect what you choose. But also importantly, that though you have free will, these 3 choices have been pre-selected for you. And the way in which they're presented to you have also been pre-selected. So these algorithms are affecting choice because they're not giving you the full universe of options, and they're anticipating and assuming certain preferences that you may have. And each time you make a selection, the algorithm or the machine learns and changes the consideration set for you. So every time you go to the Amazon landing page, not only does your landing page look different from mine because of our purchase history and our click history, but your landing page may look different every time you go there. And that's important, right? Because the decision rules that are in the machine or the algorithm may be unknown to you. You don't know what you haven't seen. And that these biases then affect your choices and interact with any potential biases that were programmed into the algorithm. So there's still a lot we don't know, and I have some projects going on about this. I'm going to share the 2 on the left that are bolded. And so quickly, I'll go through who's more likely to trust AI. So This is a paper that I have in prep with a doctoral student at MIT, Heather Yang. And we talk about humans are biased about algorithms and how they trust algorithms. And we ask the question, other people have looked at, well, does it matter if the AI has the voice of a woman, or if it's more humanoid, or if the task is different? But we look at what are the potential individual level differences with respect to cognitive style that affect these options. So let's come back to system 1 and system 2, which I talked about before. And let's revisit this and understand that system 1 and system 2, though we all have both, we may have a dominant system. So there may be system 1 dominant people or system 2 dominant people. And that is called cognitive style. So there's a way to measure cognitive style, and it's called the cognitive reflection test, and it was created by Frederick in 2008, and it's pretty robust to the point that we can use only 3 questions. So you see this first question, a bat and a ball cost $1.10 in total. The bat costs $1 more than the ball. How much does the ball cost? If it takes 5 machines, 5 minutes to make 5 widgets, how long would it take 100 machines to make 100 widgets? And in a lake, there's a patch of lily pads. Every day the patch doubles in size. If it takes 48 days for the patch to cover the entire lake, how long would it take for the patch to cover half the lake? Now, here's the thing about these 3 questions. The seemingly obvious answer is the wrong one. And so what this measures is your ability to interrupt your system 1 intuitive thinking and be more analytical and deliberative by using system 2. This measure has been shown, by the way, to be predictive of people who believe in fake news. So the lower you the score, the more likely you are to be a system 1 dominant thinker, the more likely you are to believe in fake news and conspiracies. The more likely you are to be a system 2 thinker, the more you are able to engage in things like reward deferment, which is important, obviously, for success, because when you're in college, you need to know not to go to the party tonight, you have a final exam tomorrow. Or self-control, which again is important for success because that helps you sort of manage your time, manage your money, and things of that nature. By the way, I'm sure you got all of the questions right, but just in case you were wondering, here are the correct questions at the bottom. So Heather and I did an experiment where we had a variety of decision scenarios. Here's one where you're asked to make a decision on an investment, and you're asked to show the proportion of artificially intelligent or human a financial advisor, and a series of questions around your behavior there. And we tested with the cognitive reflection test, also known as the CRT. We ran 11 studies in different domains, but I'll show you just one. The research always came out the same. And that is that system 1 dominant thinkers are biased against algorithms. System 2 dominant thinkers demonstrate what is known as algorithmic appreciation. They prefer algorithmic input over human input when making decisions in a variety of domains. System 1 thinkers, however, experience algorithmic aversion. They have a preference for human versus algorithmic advisors when making decisions. This is really important because the people who are system 2 dominant tend to be the people who are making decisions about who gets a loan, who gets hired, who gets health insurance. And then if those thinkers are predisposed, that cognitive style is predisposed to rely heavily on algorithms, then it becomes critical that we understand better the interaction between human and AI and the biases therein. A second study I'd like to just quickly share with you, based on the question, does the involvement of AI in human decisions affect the accountability with respect to the outcomes? So you may be familiar with the Milgram experiments, right? Where people were asked to press a button that would give a shock to a participant, and they were being told when to press the button by some other actor. And those results showed that people are so interested in being obedient that they will go so far as to torture another person if they're able to say, well, this person told me to do it. I was simply following orders. Well, when we think about the use of algorithms may be assumed to be neutral, but they can be indeed biased. And some research is starting to identify this. A recent study out of MIT suggesting that banks and the hiring algorithms that I showed you before aren't solving the problem. We can't use algorithms to replace humans in the hopes that they'll be less biased because they use numbers. Because each of those numbers is a person, and those numbers may be biased in terms of who's represented and who's not. I'll show you another example of a biased algorithm. This is from a company called Geographic. So this company is hoping to help companies improve the use of their big data by using machine learning to predict which of the people in their data sets are, for instance, female or male. Now I'm going to quickly play this. And so if you look at this sort of item here, you'll see, typing in the name Megan Smith, the algorithm predicts the likelihood that this is a woman. And so over 60% chance that this is female. But when you add Dr. Megan Smith, you see the algorithm flips and now says there's a 76% chance that Dr. Megan Smith is male. We also see machine learning getting it wrong when, for instance, 64 Black patients lost a chance at a kidney transplant because of an algorithm that treated Black patients differently. Or with image upscaling, seeing an image of Barack Obama upscaled by an algorithm, and because of the data on which it was trained, upscaling the image to be a white man. There's also facial recognition technologies that are being used and show that facial recognition is biased and in fact does not recognize Black faces as well, and moreover has led to false arrests of Black people because the algorithm assumed Black people look the same. So who then is held accountable for these negative outcomes? This is research that is ongoing with a doctoral student at the Media Lab, Ziv Epstein, and David Rand, who's a fellow professor at Sloan. And in these experiments, we present the participants with a negative outcome. So something that suggests that the outcome was untoward because there was a potential racial bias suggested. And we randomly assigned participants to the condition of whether they're going to assess the accountability, and they were randomly assigned to whether the decision maker used AI to assist with the decision or not. And so the research question then is who's held accountable? Does this affect the perceived responsibility of this decision maker in the experiment for the outcome? So in the experiment, we have Jerry. This is a stock photo. We settled on a generic name like Jerry. No offense to anyone whose name is Jerry. And this is Bernard, also a stock photo and a relatively generic name. Once again, no offense to anyone named Bernard. I like both names. And in these experiments, we asked them to observe and to make a decision based on Jerry's decisions that affected Bernard. So just for example, in one scenario, Jerry is a recruiting officer for hiring at a big tech company. Bernard is the applicant. And Bernard seems qualified for the job. However, Jerry has an intuition that he is not and passes. Bernard then subsequently goes on to work at another firm and wins industry awards for his excellent performance. We have another example here where Jerry's the admissions officer. He passes on Bernard, who seems qualified, but Jerry does not admit him. Bernard then goes on to another school and wins a series of accolades and thrives and does quite well. So as you can see in these scenarios, Jerry is reliant on his intuition. His intuition based on the results suggests that Jerry not only was wrong, but that perhaps there was a racial bias. Now, we don't talk about racial bias here. We leave it to the participant to imagine whether that played a role. And so in our results, we find that in these scenarios where Jerry's decision-making was assisted by AI, when asked how responsible for the outcome is Jerry, Jerry is judged as less responsible when AI assisted, when Jerry conferred with an algorithmic advisor. And so we find that participants attribute less responsibility to the person when AI is involved, suggesting that when negative outcomes happen and AI is involved, people assume, well, the algorithm made me do it. And this is really important as we're unearthing more and more bias with AI in, for instance, medical spaces, and where machine learning and algorithms are being considered for deciding, for instance, who gets the coronavirus vaccine. So I'll stop here and say that we need to think about human AI integration, and we need to think about the possible harms before we sort of run and implement AI everywhere, and especially who's most vulnerable, right? And for companies that think about this and companies that anticipate this, there can in fact be a competitive advantage. For instance, Salesforce is now rolling out a policy where not only does it have a robust ethical AI group, but they are starting to expect their partners and their customers to adhere to a code of ethics around AI and meet that. That will increasingly be the case. And the competitive advantage really will come from the fact that humans, your customers, for instance, will feel more at ease and potentially more trusting of sharing their data with you if you demonstrate and signal that you're thinking about how to protect the humans behind the data points. And then, of course, the question becomes, what is the right balance of AI and human input for whom and when? And really asking the question, should AI even be involved at this particular point in the first place? Not everything should be decided by AI, despite the fact that humans may be biased. It's important that we not augment that bias by implementing systems that amplify that bias. So I'm going to stop here, and I think we're going to open it up for Q&A. Thank you guys for your attention.
Indeed, we are. Thank you so much, Professor Gosline. I always learn so much when we're together, and I appreciate you both prompting all of these questions at MIT and working on such important work. So thank you so much.
My pleasure.
A couple of questions here. So, but please feel free to keep adding them in the chat as we go along. So this was submitted during the registration process. And so someone asked, how do we ensure that machine-driven decision-making is gender and race blind?
That is a great question. That's a pivotal question, and one that I think about quite a bit. So here's my first sort of response to that question. When we talk about human beings and becoming colorblind or gender blind, one of the first things you'll hear is that that's not a realistic expectation. It is impossible for me to expect that you will see me without also seeing my race and my gender. And it's not something that we should strive for, because my perspective and my experience is valuable. Why strip me of that? I think we need to take the same tack when we think about AI machine learning, in that these variables will be measured and will correlate with and will impact some of the conclusions. The question becomes, how do we balance the role of gender or race when we're building these systems? How can we collect data that is representative so that it's not excluding or minimizing the impact of whatever decisions are being made on women or people of color, for example? How can we get data scientists that are more representative? And so Kathy was kind enough to share with me that question in advance. And so I just put down kind of like a quick, multi-step, here's some steps to take to mitigate the impact of that bias. So if you bear with me, I would love to just quickly share that with you. So how to combat AI bias, here's a 6-step plan. The first is to ask whether AI should be even doing it. I think there's a lot of magic around AI, and this idea that AI is magic, that, machine learning is so much smarter than humans. And so, let the machine figure it out. But we know that that's just simply not true. And anyone who spends a lot of time doing this stuff will disabuse you of that notion. So recent incidents in the pandemic in Britain, for instance, where machine learning was used because students could not sit their standardized tests for admission to university. Machine learning was used to take their past performance and predict what their score would have been had they sat for that standardized test. So AI shouldn't be doing that, right? That's not a good use of AI. AI also shouldn't be used for things like predictive policing, right? If you've ever seen the film Minority Report, it's all about how technology can predict now who's committing a crime. And so before the crime is committed, arresting the would-be offender. Well, that time is now, and AI should not be used for predictive policing, right? It shouldn't be used to predict who's more likely to commit a crime and therefore go and either arrest or invade privacy and surveil and so on and so forth. The second thing is question the assumptions of AI, right? And this has to be part of a culture and a mind shift. Not that AI is a panacea and can fix what ails human biased decision-making, and not that, oh, that's for the data science people and I look at this, right? We need to create a culture where everyone is asking these questions. And yes, we focus on data, but we also simultaneously focus on those data being gathered and implemented in an ethical fashion and model this. And this is really critical, not just for a tech setting, but inclusive leadership in general. So questioning the assumptions and questioning the routines that become sort of rote and that can often perpetuate biases. The third thing I would say is not to assume algorithmic neutrality. And so I've put a couple of sources here for folks who would like to dig into this a little bit more. There's Coded Bias, which is a documentary that features Joy Bulamwini, who is at the Media Lab, and about her experience working on facial recognition and noticing that the models didn't recognize her and her features. MIT Sloan experts recently did a show with Kathy O'Neill, who's the author of Weapons of Math Destruction, which I highly recommend. It's about her experience as a data analyst on Wall Street and showing how these AI machine learning models not just reflected bias, but also created bias by determining, who would get sort of get loans and who kind of was able to access resources. And Kathy Baxter was on this show as well, who is the head of ethical AI at Salesforce, and me. I also recommend Algorithms of Repression, a fantastic book by Safiya Noble. As you can see, just even here on the cover, Google reflects many of these biases. So if you type into Google 3 Black teenagers, right, you'll see images of mugshots. But if you type in 3 white teenagers, you'll see stock photos of kids at soccer games and things of that nature. Or as you can see here on the cover, writing in "Why are Black women so?" the algorithm will auto-complete that with clearly a reflection of some negative and biased thoughts about race. I mentioned Kathy's book, and there's another one called Race After Technology by Rua Benjamin. The fourth thing I would say is data diversity and data scientist diversity, right? So implicit biases that are held by people can become systematic if we don't diversify the people who are programming the models and the data that goes in. That's that garbage in, garbage out I mentioned before. Being transparent. Here you can see some protests that ensued after that use of machine learning for the British school standardized test. And so you don't want to find yourself in a situation where your customers or your employees are like, what were you doing with our data? How were you using these models if a negative outcome were to happen, right? You want to be proactive and you want to be transparent. And I think one way to do this would be with model cards. So let me show you an example here. This is a children's sinus medicine. And if you buy one of these things, you will see the facts on the label that show you, who's this for? What are the ingredients? What are the assumptions about the type of caloric diet, et cetera, et cetera? Well, so too should you consider using model cards. These were developed by the ethical team at Google, and this is the future. This is what people are going to expect to share. So you can see here the intended use, what data were used to build this model, what the ethical considerations are, what are the caveats and recommendations. Not every AI model is applicable for every purpose. And so understanding the parameters of this and understanding scope is going to be an important part of transparency, right? By saying we use it for this, but we don't use it for that. And that's really important, right? In research, we always say, well, here are the assumptions. Here are the boundary conditions. We should be doing the same. And last but not least, I think it's going to be important for organizations to create or identify a role for someone who's going to serve as the sort of translator, if you will, of all of this stuff. You know, I find that the people who do the behavioral work and the ethicists or the people who work in DE&I in organizations, they're quite separated from the data scientists. And that's really a shame, because the conversation should be one that's you know, kind of happening between these folks and not siloed. But perhaps it does happen because people who don't know these phrases, these words, it can be intimidating, right? I don't know anything about machine learning. I don't even know what an algorithm is. And so how could someone who has that expertise feel comfortable engaging in those conversations? And so I think it's going to be important to be deliberate about having someone in the organization who serves that role. And so as you can see these different silos and these different groups, I think it would be good to have some kind of translator who bridges those structural holes, and also ensuring that you have inclusive groups that are working on this and holding the partners accountable. Thank you for whoever asked that question, because it really motivated me to think about actions that can be taken right away. So I appreciate your thinking about this. It's something I think about all the time.
Thank you. And thank you for laying that out so clearly. I did get a chat from someone if you would be willing to share those actions in the 6 slides following. And I think the answer is yes, but I just want to check in on that.
The answer is yes.
Great. Thank you. I know we're recording the session, but yes, I know folks are looking for to follow those 6 steps that you just put out. So I have a couple of questions here in the chat. One is, what can employees do to ensure their employer is using algorithms ethically?
That is such a great question. So I think you should raise the question. That's the first thing. You know, different sort of organizations vary, right? Some organizations have a more porous sort of wall between the data scientists and everyone else in the organization. But I actually think that's the exception and not the rule. I would say learn as much as you can. I've given you some resources, and just start to get comfortable with the vocabulary. I think this stuff seems a lot scarier than it actually is, but really all an algorithm is a set of decision rules. And really all machine learning is instead of me running one experiment, a machine can run multiple experiments simultaneously, almost infinitely, right? And say, okay, now I've gotten all the results of those experiments. Here's what I've found. But that doesn't mean it's more intelligent than a human. We still haven't, you know, we haven't built better than what we got right up here right now, right? And so I think this is going to be a cultural shift where we need to create a culture where people feel comfortable asking, like, what are the ingredients for this model? And that people are pushed to speak about it in terms that are accessible to all. You know, for me as a researcher, it's important for me to be able to talk about my research in ways that are accessible to all. I gain no pleasure from confusing people, right? And we need to have, I mean, hopefully my students would agree, and we need to have a culture in our organizations where no matter how brilliant you are, you're not going to be effective if we don't understand what you're talking about. So if the people in DE&I and diversity, equity, inclusion talked about arcane and esoteric stuff, they wouldn't achieve their goals. Well, the folks in machine learning or in the data science, if they do this, they won't achieve their goals as well. So as an employee, I recommend you read some of this stuff. You start to bridge those ties. And to the extent that you can offer ideas for how to be more productive, for how to be better, and any organization, they should be seeking that information and that feedback. I would recommend, hey, can we have, I don't know, lunch table brown paper bag lunches where the data scientists talk about what they're doing. By the way, spoiler alert, like 90% of what data scientists do is data cleaning. So, but that's good to know too. And so I recommend, sort of breaching those walls and having those conversations and getting comfortable with getting uncomfortable around nerd talk.
That makes it such a less scary task. So thank you for sharing that. And as our colleagues in systems dynamics would say, get close to the work and really understand what's going on. And so when you say that, it just reminds me so much of our colleagues there. So we have a question about applied ethics and philosophy. And so the question is, do you see a rise in the study of applied ethics and philosophy in the AI realm?
You will. At the College of Computing at MIT, there's a focus on interdisciplinary faculty. And in fact, they're actually, I believe, recruiting now for a philosophy professor at the College of Computing, right? So, MIT, and I'm not just saying this because I'm at MIT, but MIT is always like, 5 years, maybe 10 years ahead of what everybody else is doing. And so if that holds, as it has happened in the past, I expect more universities to do this. But let's think about what that means for organizations, companies, right? What I believe is important is to have a buddy team of data and behavioral scientists, right? People who understand how to manipulate the data and build those models, coupled with people who understand cognitive bias, how to design systems to minimize those cognitive biases, how to nudge people to make better decisions. And then those people, that buddy team, if you will, who would be in charge of running experiments and analyzing the data and that sort of thing, should also be partnered with the folks who are responsible for ethics and inclusivity within the organization. To me, that would be my magic wand. Renee can have a perfect world. To me, that would be what things would look like. And so I hope that this trend that I'm seeing, at least with regard to philosophy, is the beginning of a changing tide.
I like to think about that magic wand, especially with our colleagues at MIT. So there's a couple of questions here that I think we can probably get through in our last 5 minutes here. But someone is curious about how you think about DEI outside of the US and in international organizations and applying your research to different geographic areas.
That's a great question. Thank you, Andrew. So as a child of immigrants myself, I grew up with sort of this bicultural identity. It's always been, I think I'm born in the United States, but I also sort of had this bicultural consciousness that allowed me to sort of think about, the differences in culture, and that's important to me. I would say with respect to DE&I, it's really important to understand context, right? Things that are offensive in one culture may not be in another. And I think it's tremendously important as the world gets smaller, right? And I don't know where you all are located today, but certainly you could be anywhere on Earth as long as you have a Wi-Fi signal. And so I think that this issue of DE&I outside the United States is critical. I actually just recently had an article in Harvard Business Review with some fellow Black professors at other institutions, and we touched on this topic as well, because in MBA programs in particular, people are coming from all over the world, and some of these issues that we talk about in the States may not make a ton of sense or may seem sort of not critical. And so that's important for us to talk in a way that brings everyone in and meets them where they are. But that also means when we go abroad, we need to do the same. And so I think about the application of my research outside of the States and encourage that and actually have been involved with different countries in implementing some of the work against, cognitive biases, not necessarily race-based cognitive biases, but cognitive biases, particularly because I do a lot of work on customer experience, digital customer experience, and things of that nature.
Thank you. So we have one last question here in the chat. Are there downsides to us being so reliant on AI? Does it disrupt and hinder our cognitive processes?
I love that question. Elizabeth. Thank you for asking it. So I have a 4-year-old, and my 4-year-old knew how to unlock my phone before he knew how to speak. And we found ourselves in a hotel room that had a flat screen TV, and my son walked up to it and tried to zoom in on the television and was like, why isn't this working? Because he does it on the phone. Yes, there are downsides to being reliant on AI. Downsides involve, number one, when there are biases and those harms that become systematized, right? And that they're unconscious. We don't even know. The downside also comes with use of data that can be problematic. And so ethics need to be at the core of all of this. But there are downsides to the outsourced mind, as I call it, in that we become less conscious of how we think and what those sort of processes are. So I like to recommend, and in my book I talk about random acts of inconvenience. It's so convenient to let the algorithm suggest something to us, solve the problem for us, tell us what to do. Practice random acts of inconvenience. Practice taking the long route. Practice actually typing in your password and not letting facial recognition do it for you. Practice doing some research before your next purchase and not just clicking what the recommendation engine says. Practice, right, looking beyond what the Google results say a condition looks like or a person looks like, and do a little bit more research. Practice those acts of inconvenience and you'll be far more equipped to question things like fake news, to take a beat before you reblog or repost something that is rooted in bad faith actors and their agenda. Practice that and get comfortable with still not being completely reliant on AI. You can use it. I'm not here to judge you. I use it myself. But understand that the more distanced we become from our choices, the less we feel responsible for them. And that's really a scary notion if we have biased AI. Thank you for your question, Elizabeth.
Thank you so much, Professor Gosline. I could sit here and listen all day. I know we're at time here. Thank you for joining us today in this incredible session, and we will share the information with all of you following this. Thank you to all of you Dean Circle donors for joining us today. At MIT Sloan during the campaign, we often say a better world is our business, and our faculty are shining examples of that. So thank you again for sharing that gift with us. And because of your tremendous partnership as Dean Circle donors, we're able to continue and scale this work. And so thank you to all of you. Until we can be together again in person, please be safe and be well. Take care.
Thanks, everybody. Be safe. Thank you.